Hello, everybody, and welcome to Purpose Up and Done Doing That. Today, I am very excited and honored to have with me Dr. Srini Pillay. Welcome, Srini.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
Oh, it's my honor and pleasure. I'm so psyched, and I've been geeking out about asking you all these questions about the research and brain stuff behind why we do the things that we do. So today, I just want to tee things up by saying we're talking about the neuroscience and the psychology behind why we do things that we're not necessarily proud of. And I couldn't think of a better person than a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, psychologist, and someone who's written many books on how our brain works. So can we kick things off and you can tell people a little bit about who you are and the work that you do?
Sure. I actually do a large number of things. So I am a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, and I currently have a clinical practice. I used to run the anxiety disorder service at McLean Hospital, which is Harvard's largest hospital in psychiatry. And I also did 17 years of brain imaging research looking at brain blood flow as it pertains to emotional struggles that people have. And I currently also work with executives through a company that I call Neuro Business Group, which essentially helps leaders develop using their brains so that they can make the changes that they need to make in their lives. I also work in biotechnology across cancer, heart disease, stroke, in a number of different disorders. I have 3 tech startups that I've co-founded, and I just finished writing an operetta. So I'm trying to have fun with life.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can imagine you've gotten rid of all of those limiting beliefs that allow you to do all of the stuff.
Yeah, I just think that I have one very simple philosophy about life, which is that you live, you die, you do something in between. Make it a fun time as long as you can, but when you can't, you can't. And so, I'm not even always accepting of that. I forget that from time to time. But I think if we have a couple of basic principles like self-forgiveness, we can learn to jump over those hurdles to live the life that I believe every human being is meant to live, which is a life of flourishing and a life of manifesting deep action from consciousness.
Okay. So what I wanted to do is kind of look at the spectrum from procrastination as an addiction to, harder drugs that, people get totally destroyed by. So when we look at that from the kind of, brain imaging and what we know about brain science, what do those have in common?
Procrastination and addiction.
Yes.
So I think procrastination is essentially, there's a subtle distinction. So a lot of people think it's a failure of intention, which is why we set these New Year's goals and resolutions. But actually, there's a subtle difference because recent research has shown that it's actually what fails between intention and action. So you intend not to procrastinate, but somehow you can't get yourself to do what you need to do. And I think with addictions, a lot of people feel like I've got to stop doing something. They know that, but they can't actually get to the place where where they can actually stop doing that. So I think what they both share is some kind of failure of mental process or consciousness that's going on between intention and action.
Okay. And so when we look at that at the kind of brain level, is that our subconscious hijacking us? And if it is, how can we unhijack ourselves?
So there are a lot of different reasons. I think that for some people it's just conscious. So it's really not taking the time to think about something consciously. And that's what stops you converting your intention into action. So for example, you might say, I have a good time binge drinking or drinking excessively. And that's what I feel like doing. And then you say, well, if somebody reminds you, of course that's enjoyable, like who wouldn't enjoy it in that context? But they remind you, you also have the goal of living longer and looking younger. Then when you realize that consciously, that might be able to help you moderate how you want to drink. So in that sense, it's conscious. But I think the real issue here is when it comes to the unconscious, because you hear a lot out there. There are a lot of, in fact, I was just complaining about this to a colleague of mine this morning. I was saying, God, why is it that every editor I talk to and every person who wants to respond to sort of psychological interventions wants to hear the usual, like Well, grit is really important. It correlates with success. If you persevere at something and you do it over and over again, you will be successful. You won't be addicted anymore. Well, guess what? Marcus Creedy and his colleagues have done a study, a meta-analysis of 66,000 people showing that grit does not really contribute to success, which means that for a large number of people, when they persevere, they get nowhere. So if you're someone who's been persevering at stopping this addiction and you got nowhere, and someone says to you, the reason I got somewhere is that I persevered, we're very bad at knowing why we are successful. Like, we think it's because we persevered, because we're not realizing that there are a bunch of people who persevered who've not gotten to their goal. So that's one element. I think the other thing is people will say, like the kinds of techniques that I'll talk to you about today, it's a very commonly held belief that if you practice them over and over again, you'll get better at them, which of course makes sense at some level. But when Brooke McNamara and her colleagues at Princeton looked at how much of the success pie, when it comes to education and jobs even, does deliberate practice account for, what they found was that for education, it's 4%, and for jobs, it's less than 1%, which means that somehow humans are not wired to get bored out of their minds doing something over and over again. That if you ask someone who's been successfully able to manage their addiction, they would say, you know, I went through the 12 steps and I did it over and over again. And because I repeated it, I did well at it. What they don't realize is that there are a number of people who've repeated it who've actually failed. So the practice itself is really not enough. The third thing is, I think there are books written about, you know, all you have to do is change your habits from bad habits to good ones. Sounds great, beautiful idea. In fact, it's the basis of addiction, right? With addiction, the neural basis is that you get caught up in habit hell, and you just repeat that habit over and over again. So a lot of people who've written books about habit would say, all you need to do is identify the habit, know that it's not good for you, and then change it. Well, 97% of diets fail. You know, a bunch of people after a coronary bypass graft will go back to smoking more. So, you know, so then the question we have to ask is, if it's such a great idea, how come we're not doing it? And then there's my all-time least favorite of all, which is we should do things one step at a time. Sounds great. We all turn to that. It's fantastic. The problem is, for the large majority of people, it doesn't work. John Locke, who did the original research on goals, actually found that humans are surprisingly not motivated by mediocrity. And when you think about that, you're like, what does that mean? Well, you know, just be sensible. Like, don't try to like go cold turkey on the drug. Like, just go from like doing a lot to doing a little to doing a little less. Turns out that doesn't work as well. So there's a contradiction in the literature, because every one of those people, you know, from Angela Duckworth to people who've done the work on deliberate practice, Malcolm Gladwell popularized the notion of 10,000 hours. You know, people like Charles Duhigg have talked about habit circuits. And I mean, there's just a lot of people who've done the whole one step at a time, BJ Fogg. All of them have done research that's shown that it's worked. So how come in everyday life, the stuff is not working? I don't think their research is necessarily wrong. I just think that they are already working with a group of people who are motivated.
Right.
I think for a large number of people who are suffering from addiction, they haven't tapped into fundamental motivation and what it actually means to be motivated. Because motivation is not just, well, you know, a carrot and stick, let me get that reward. Humans are not that silly. So I guess 2 points I'd want to make about that broadly. One is the fact that they are both, all these researchers I mentioned are probably both right and wrong, as am I. I think exemplifies the fact, it basically teaches us that we are all wired in very paradoxical ways. That as much as we would like to think, you know, it's the sensible ones who do well, the truth is, I've worked with, you know, people at all levels of life with all kinds of levels of success. And what I find is that, you know, after 17 years of studying the brain, we're wired kind of funnily. That these same circuits that help us to learn, you know, these habit circuits, they help us to learn, they help us to, you know, absorb information and use, like the kind of information I'm telling you. You know, I've read that and I've had this experience. These very same circuits can lead to addiction. So we're not wired in simple ways. And I think the first biological reason to forgive yourself is to recognize that it is complex to be human.
Okay, so we can first forgive ourselves as the first step in addressing these addictions and understanding that we're funny creatures that can't necessarily explain our behavior.
Yeah. And I think if for a lot of people, because I see a lot of people who try to change their habits, take small steps, who try to persevere and who are trying to practice doing something, and then they fall off the wagon. And part of what they think is, well, there must be something wrong with me. And what I would say is, I don't think it's about there being something wrong with you. Those techniques will work really well if we can just talk a little bit about what motivates you and what this actually means in your life. So, I think that gets back to what I think you're interested in, which is a sense of purpose. And I think for a lot of people, one of the key ingredients when it comes to being motivated, I would say two things. One is recognizing how much the fear circuits actually disrupt our brains and our thinking, so that even unconsciously, if we have great conscious intentions, it's our fears that often stand in our way. And then I think there's also the fact that a sense of purpose can be really powerful in helping to motivate us to our goal. So if anyone's out there thinking, man, I've not been able to crack the code on this addiction, and how do I get to the other side? The first thing I would say is it possible that you've got the right thoughts, but that your fear is always interrupting your decision circuits? Because in the brain, the fear center and the thinking brain are connected. And
Right.
even unconscious fears, things that you're not aware of, can disrupt your thinking. So you may have the best intentions, but your fear is not allowing your brain to manifest that intention because your thinking circuits are not strong anymore. And we can talk about ways in which people can deal with this. So that's the one thing I'll ask you to ask yourself. And the second question is, can I think in a more real way about my sense of purpose so that I actually feel motivated to drop this destructive habit that's ruining my life?
Okay, that's so thinking about purpose, and then I mean the question that I have is a lot of people have talked about early trauma kind of instilling these fear circuits and behaviors, and then the need to self-soothe with these addictions, and that kind of running the subconscious show. Is that kind of a simplified explanation of it? How does that jive with what in your research and how you've treated folks?
Yes, absolutely. So I think certainly when I ran the anxiety disorders clinic, I saw a lot of people with anxiety and with trauma, and who also had this diagnosis of substance abuse or dependence, because they were using it as a self-soothing mechanism. And, I think with early life trauma, one of the things we do when we are much younger is we soothe ourselves with oral habits, right? Like pacifiers. But people who've had a form of neglect, who've not been able to soothe themselves, will turn to adult oral behaviors like ingesting substances. And when they do, they will use these substances to self-soothe. So that's one part of it. I think from a biological perspective, one of the things that is notable is that early life trauma can actually change the wiring in the memory systems of the brain. So the hippocampus, which is the memory system in the brain, is part of the memory system, is actually disrupted. And sometimes you actually find that early life trauma, people have smaller hippocampi. So their memory systems are not working well. A lot of us rely on remembering our lives and having a sense of continuity in our identity. But when you don't have the sense of continuity in identity, when you feel like you're just a fragment, when you're a collection of different fragments, that collection of fragments can really be troubling. And so the substances are used as a form of glue, so you can just essentially go outwards and try to sort of make a haze so that you can put all these fragments together. So I do think that early life trauma can contribute to substance abuse and addiction. And I think that one of the mechanisms is by damaging the memory systems in the brain, this can actually cause problems. Also, with early life trauma, you've got this sensitivity, right? You've got the sensitivity to fear. In the most extreme cases, we call this an exaggerated startle response. So, for most of us, if someone said, boo, like from the corner, we get a little freaked out. But for people who've got a history of trauma, anything that's frightening, they have an exaggerated blink, they freak out more because they have very sensitive neural systems to any form of stress. So in the brain, just to sort of set the stage for how fear works in the brain, in the brain, fear can be conscious. Like you can have sweating, trembling, unsteadiness, feeling like your environment's unfamiliar, palpitations, nausea, shortness of breath, fear of dying, fear of going crazy, chills, choking, chest pain. These are the kinds of symptoms that accompany anxiety often. And so when we have that, we know we're freaking out, and we know that we probably can't think straight because the anxiety center is connected to the thinking brain. And we'll come later to how you can actually manage this connection. But the anxiety center is connected to the thinking brain. And so that's part of the reason you're freaking out. But sometimes you say to yourself, man, I'm trying so hard to drop the substance. But the moment I see it, I feel tempted, or I just can't stop myself. And I think what people don't realize is that when we have unconscious fears left over from that early trauma, that the amygdala, which is the brain's alarm system, when there are earthquakes in that region, it sends aftershocks to the thinking brain. And so no matter what your thoughts are, it's very hard to keep going with your rational thoughts, because under the radar, without your knowledge, this anxiety is blasting your thinking brain the whole time.
That's not cool.
So not cool. Which is why I've developed a technique that I teach people on ways to rewire their brains so that they can remove the blood that's going to the amygdala, so basically redirect it from the anxiety center back to the thinking brain. And that's a 5-step process, which is based on a ton of research. And I like to say to people, I've been a physician for over 25 years. I've studied brains for 17 years. And I believe that everything I say is both right and wrong. And I both believe and don't believe what I'm saying, because research is based on a law of averages. Right. And I've never met an average person in my life. Like, I think, certainly as a psychiatrist, you really get to understand people's exceptional qualities. So while I use this as a framework and a guide, I'm not someone who's going to be standing saying, this is the ultimate truth, this is the gospel. Like, there are a lot of ways you can approach this. But if you look at this 5-step framework, it's defined by the mnemonic C.I.R.C.A. C-I-R-C-A. So anybody listening to this can write down just in a straight line, C-I-R-C-A.
Okay.
And what each letter stands for. So the first is chunking, which is breaking things down into little pieces, which is what I said about, the BJ Fogg Tiny Habits piece, and we'll come back to that. The I is for ignore mental chatter. And what that is mindfulness. So essentially placing your attention on your breath, and whatever thoughts you have, you just let them, and if you find, you let them go. And if you find that your attention is going back to them, gently bring your flashlight back to your breath. Then the R is for reality check, which in self-talk means this too shall pass. No matter how bad the situation is, no matter what is going on, telling yourself this too shall pass will calm your brain down. Then there's control check, which is like the serenity prayer, which essentially means, everybody's thinking that, I don't know what to do about climate, the presidency, the stock market. Well, if you're not going to do anything about that, you are occupying attentional units that are valuable in your brain with stuff you're going to do nothing about. So identify what you can't control and then let go of that, so you've got more attention available to do what you need to do. And then the last step is attention shift away from the problems back to the solution. So it's chunking, ignore mental chatter, reality check, control check, and attention shift. And whenever you get to a situation, so let's say you were clean for a while and you're not on any drugs, you go to a party, somebody offers you a drink, you say no thank you, the next thing you know, somebody spills a drink on you, you smell the alcohol on your sleeve, and you're like, man, I'm dying for a beer. Like, I've got to have one drink. So you have one, and one leads to 2, leads to 3, leads to 4, leads to 5, 6, and all of a sudden, you're completely wasted, and you don't know what to do about it. So when you go back home, and you're like, obviously, understandably freaked out about it, you say, what am I going to do about this? This is like impossible. I am never going to be able to do anything about this. And then I say, well, let's go through C.I.R.C.A. So chunking means, instead of thinking of your whole life, which is sort of really scary to your brain, ask yourself, what will I do in the next week? How about I avoid parties? How about I avoid places where there's alcohol? Just for the next week. You don't have to say I'm going to avoid a party for the rest of my life, because you may not. So just if you break it down for the next week and the next 2 weeks, it calms your brain down more. I would suggest starting with the second step, which is ignore mental chatter, because really, when you are in a mindful state,
Right.
you are less stressed, and stress precipitates habit circuits in the brain. So when you are stressed, you go back to your old ways of being all the time. When you are mindful, it turns down these habit circuits, and as a result, you can have new thoughts. Then reality check, this too shall pass. You're bumming out. You're like, oh, I can't believe I did this. It's like, well, you know what? It happened. I understand what happened. This is not about being punitive towards myself. It's about creating a life of fulfillment. And I'll come back to that point in a little bit. But I think it's really important to have that reframing of this is gonna pass, because it did.
Right.
Then control check is essentially saying to yourself, like, what can I control? What can I not control? Well, apparently I can't control the temptation after I smell the alcohol. And apparently I can control whether I surround myself with alcohol. Now, again, a lot of people take a very hard stance to this. And for some people, it actually works to take that stance because they're just hardcore about it. The problem is, I find with a lot of those people, the determination is replaced by anger.
Okay.
And so they start alienating people, and they become what we call dry drunks. So what they do is the same anger that caused the out of controlness when they were drinking is there, and it's eating them up. So what I would say is, with control check, just say, in the short term, what can I control? I can control who I'm around, how I'm around them, how I want to be. And that allows you to figure out what you can and can't control. And with attention shift, rather than just thinking about, I can't believe I did that yesterday, this is a problem, my alcohol's a problem, like, what is the solution for me? Maybe in the long term, I want to have 1 drink a day. Maybe I want to have 2 drinks a week. Maybe, how about we set that out much further on? So you work with a sponsor, you try to figure out when you want to set that time. You say, okay, in 5 years, I want to be able to comfortably drink one drink a day and not freak out about it. It's unrealistic to say I'm going to be able to do that next month, and maybe even for a year. So different people, again, have different standards for this. Some people will say complete abstinence is the only way, and some people will say go little by little. I think you have to figure that out for yourself, make mistakes, come back. But with those 5 steps, when you say, I'm breaking this down, I'm going to calm myself down, it doesn't matter that it happened. It happened. I learned from it. I can't control myself when I'm exposed to alcohol, so let me put myself in positions where I can control myself, and let me pay attention to how to make this happen. All of a sudden, you've rewired your brain to help your brain figure out how to feel less addicted. And so, and there's another philosophical piece I wanted to mention around this that I think would be really helpful for people to consider. It has to do with the piece about living your life to be able to be fulfilled rather than taking a restrictive approach to your life. Like, I've got to stop doing this. Freud and a bunch of people were standing around kids and were noticing that as kids, we're kind of weird. And this is what's weird about us. Like, we're sitting in cots and we're like playing with our toys, perfectly fine. And we take the toys that belong to us and we throw it out of the cot. Already a weird behavior. Imagine if you came home and you were like, let me throw out my furniture, let me throw out my TV. It's kind of weird because this is the thing you like, you're throwing it out. Then you cry about it, even weirder. I mean, you threw it out. Like, why are you crying about it?
Yeah, my baby son was doing that this morning.
Right, right. And then you start saying, well, the mother brings the toy back and the child is like, yay, that's really happy. And you're like, okay, that's great that you're happy, but you threw it out. And then the mother turns around, the child throws it out again. And everyone's saying, okay, the child's just having, baby son is just having a fun time and he's playing a game, which is one explanation. But these behavioral psychologists and psychiatrists, and actually Freud was a neurologist, sort of start saying, wait a minute, like, what's happening here? Like, what would be motivating a child to cry over and over again? And what they said was, what's weird about this? We've noticed that in our adult patients, that they do this as well. They get into bad relationships over and over again. They replace one addiction with another. They replace the anger that went with addiction with the anger towards something else. So part of what they realized was that it's possible that our default brain wiring is that we are wired to master disappointment rather than seek fulfillment. So we want to get really good at life sucking. We basically want to you know what, I'm so good at this that I can just like mess up my life over and over again, and I'm really good at it. I pull myself together. This is the way I manage life. It's a really important dynamic for us to think about, because if we seek fulfillment, then we're saying, let me lead a happy life. And the one thing I'll say about when you don't have, an addiction vulnerability, it doesn't mean you're not vulnerable. I can think of plenty of days when, I don't think of myself as having that particular addiction vulnerability to substances. I mean, when I think about it deeply, I think we all have some kind of addiction to a way of being. And we all have some kind of addiction that is standing in our way because we're trapped in habit circuits. And until we change those habits, we just don't have that. But, in the way in which we talk about addiction, I feel fine about the fact that I don't crave those things. However, there are days when I feel like having a drink. And there are days when I feel like having more than I should. Right. And there are days when I'm like, okay, how am I going to, what am I doing? I want my consciousness to be clear. And so once you can dialogue with yourself about that, I think you get to a place where you say, how can I be fulfilled? But I think we're living in a society that's so judgmental, even with all its good advice. Take that, you must use adaptogens. And I said yesterday to my trainer, I'm going to bump up the carbs in my diet. And he was like, what? And I was like, honestly, I think the carbs they change my brain in a way that I'm not cool with. I still have the same goals for what I'm doing for working out. But, I actually had a patient who was training in a very sort of major way, went off his carbs, he became like a real jerk. And I was like, oh my God, I'm some kind of minor version of this. Because I could see, and he knew this. He even, he texted me really horrible things and then texts back saying, I'm sorry, I'm a jerk. I just am not capable of talking like a normal human being. So, we make up our minds. And so when I said that to my trainer, he was like, well, that's great. Well, since you have the same goals, what are you going to do differently? And I said, I actually have to think about this a little bit. I know all the obvious reasons, things to do. You want me to eat 5 times a day? I just don't feel like eating 5 times a day. You think I'm not eating the right amount of protein. I just can't imagine shoving that amount of protein into my being. And I'm not even sure that I believe all the research out there. So I'm going to take all the research, make up my own mind. But you can see when you're actively, dynamically involved with your life, you don't have to be right all the time. But it feels better to be in control of having that self-dialogue than letting a substance run your life. Because then you're not even, you're not in a place where you feel like anything is within your control.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And, I like the taking control over, what advice you receive so you can integrate it yourself and move forward with a position that you feel comfortable with. We're raising our son plant-based, and my wife and I are both plant-based, and, some doctors will be like, oh, that kid's going to have a protein deficiency, but, he's happy and healthy. So you have to find people that jive with you in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think we're in an age where there are just so many differences, right? Not just like diet, exercise, politically, gender, sexual orientation. There's so many differences. I think if we're going to only stick to our own kind, like if I only hung out with people who eat what I eat, I probably would not be able to have a lot of the friends I have. So I do think that for all of us as a society, there's a need to reconsider, if people have a lot of great qualities and they're doing something that's different from us, then we might want to reconsider how we interact with them. Like maybe you don't have to eat with that person, but you can hang out in other contexts. So I think it's important for us to also realize that, my last book, Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try, was actually a book that is about preserving our brains, because everyone in the world is just going focus, 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 fatigue. It's like, let me work all day and I'm just going to drain my brain. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that if you focus, unfocus, focus, unfocus, then you're working with a brain that is not going to be fatigued, that is going to not just be narrow-minded, but look at the big picture, that is not just going to ignore what's coming down the pike. You're going to understand what's happening in the future, that can find creative solutions to things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to find. And it turns out that the unfocused circuits actually overlap with the self circuits in the brain, the circuits that allow us to have the kinds of control that we're talking about. So when you're not self-connected, it's very hard to feel like you have a sense of purpose. It's very hard to be like, okay, like I'm not self-connected. Somebody is telling me to not use the substance. Someone's telling me it's bad if I'm addicted. Then you're not self-connected and you can't find creative solutions. So the one thing I recommend to people, and there are a lot of these techniques in the book, but I recommend try to figure out a way for you to actually unfocus 3 15-minute periods a day when your brain would be in a natural slump. So let's say after lunch, mid-afternoon, end of the day. When I say this to people, they often go like, I have no time to unfocus. I can't even focus.
And that doesn't mean scrolling through social media.
Yeah, it doesn't. No, absolutely not. You know, what it does mean is that, first of all, we all daydream 46.9% of the day. So you, me, everybody. So if we're unfocusing in unproductive ways, why not learn how to focus, how to unfocus productively? You know, for example, 5 to 15 minutes of a nap will give you 1 to 3 hours of clarity. So before that party, if you're going to the party and you want your brain to be an optimum and you want to have the self-regulation and the control you want, have a nap. 5 to 15 minutes will give you 1 to 3 hours of clarity. You'll be able to make much better decisions. You know, if you're thinking, well, you know, how do I work with, like, let's say you're talking to a sponsor or you're at an AA meeting and you're like, oh my God, this is so boring. This guy's going on and on and on. When you doodle, just scribble on a piece of paper, doodling actually improves your memory by 29%. So why wouldn't you do it? You know, there are kinds of daydreaming which don't work, like sitting at your desk and letting your mind float away, or, you know, really obsessing over the prior night's indiscretions. But there's a type of daydreaming that Jerome Singer has studied since the 1950s called positive constructive daydreaming. And positive constructive daydreaming essentially means, number one, set a time for that. Number two, allow yourself to be doing something low key, like knitting or gardening or walking. And remember, walking outside will make you more creative than walking on a treadmill, and walking on a curvy path will make you more creative than walking around the block. And then the third thing is just allow your mind to imagine something positive and wishful, like running through the woods with your dogs or lying on a beach. But these methods, positive constructive daydreaming, napping, doodling, these are 3 ways that you can productively unfocus to re-energize your brain, to give yourself the self-control that you want, so that you're not dealing with a brain that just doesn't have the energy to do what you need to do.
All right. Yes. In other words, if you're totally frazzled, you're not going to be able to have that control that you want, nor that vision towards where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I love all that. Question about the subconscious. Some of the guests that we've had on have talked about hypnosis, and I've actually used hypnosis in the past to help me with my last go at quitting smoking, and it's been almost 6 years, and I found that to be a profound tool. What has your experience been with hypnosis in terms of helping us rewire?
So I have very little personal experience with hypnosis, but I've done it in hospital settings, actually. So when we rotate on the services where people have psychological and medical problems, we actually use hypnosis for pain, and it actually helps significantly. And then from the research itself, what I know is that there are a significant number of studies that show that hypnosis can be helpful for addiction. And what it does is it does this pattern interrupt, right? So rather than going around in these stress circuits, it just it basically goes around, it short circuits all of that and goes around to another circuit where you're connecting more with a different state of consciousness. So I think that hypnosis can work, but like everything that I mentioned, I think all of these techniques need to be taken into consideration. I mean, so far, what we've talked about is C.I.R.C.A. We've talked about understanding that you want to live a life of seeking fulfillment. We've talked about the 3 techniques for unfocus and then hypnosis. I think all of these are such powerful methods for us. And I think writing all of these things down and then saying, which one do I want to try first, like, which appeals to me? There are people who are not suggestible. Okay. And not suggestible, then hypnosis doesn't work. Because they're just like rational and talk about, I'm not going to that state. I'm not going to that state. And it's difficult. Like, I think I would be a good candidate for hypnosis because I think I'm always open to any kind of suggestion. So I feel I'd be well suited to it. And it sounds like you were too.
Yes. All right. Is there anything that we haven't covered that we think would be helpful for people? I mean, you've given us some great stuff, and I love that summary that you just gave us. But anything else for people that are struggling that you think we haven't covered yet?
I mean, I think the most thing, yeah, I think a lot. And so this is a subject that's actually close to my heart. You know, when we talk about purpose, I think a lot of people get confused by this. They're like, I'm not motivated. No, I mean, it's scary that so many people are not motivated to live their fullest lives. And
Right.
they often feel like they just don't have what it takes. Well, one of the things that I most believe in the world, and I don't feel like it's just some kind of fake optimism, because I feel like I've discovered this as a clinician in the people that I've worked with, is that every person has something special that they can connect to, that they can do in their lives. And the example I like to use for this is the one laptop per child. Like, you know, I was very competitive in high school and medical school, my residency. I think in part so I could just say that I think education is kind of ridiculous in the sense that so many people define who they are and what they deserve by their level of formal education, which is just a system of learning. It does not say anything about how smart you are. And the example of the one laptop per child is that they dropped these laptops in rural Ethiopia where kids had never seen technology before. So, you know, they were like, would they eat them? Would they sit on them? But they had no idea what that would be. And what they actually found was that within a couple of minutes, they found the on-off switch. Within a couple of hours, they were singing ABC songs, and I think it might have been days, singing ABC songs and using apps. And within a couple of months, they had hacked Android. Now, they didn't even know what a computer was. But what they did have was curiosity, drive, and the absence of these self-limiting beliefs. Like, hey, what's this thing? Let me touch this. Let me figure out how this works. And just by being curious, they were able to find this ingenuity to help get them to where they want to get to. So I think if there's a place I would want to end, I think it would be wanting to tell people that if you have any kind of self-doubt, I think it's completely normal. I think we all doubt ourselves because we all mess up on so many things. But remember, you also have this capacity, this ingenuity that has nothing to do with your education. It has nothing to do with how fluently you speak or don't speak or how you look or how you don't look. That it really doesn't matter. If you allow yourself to be curious, you will actually unleash what this is. And there are so many methods to be able to do this. You know, mindfulness meditation, for example, has helped a lot of people try to get to this place where they're standing outside of judgment. They're just looking at themselves, but they don't judge themselves. So if there's one big message I'd like to leave people with, it is that every human being is endowed with the same kind of ingenuity, but most people live their lives never giving themselves the opportunity to access their own brilliance. And that's the thing I think that will lead people out of these addictive states, because they'll be inspired to live life with a greater sense of purpose once they can tap into this energy about themselves.
Amen. Amen. I love that message. Thanks so much. So you've got a free gift for our audience today, right?
Yes, it was the Procrastination ebook, which is it's a fun book. It's something that I came up with because I think people didn't realize that there were different kinds of procrastinators. So there are those kinds of procrastinators who just don't get to the goal because they're avoiding the goal.
Right.
There are those kinds of procrastinators that don't get there because they get a high from actually waiting till the last minute. And then there are those people who are just sort of totally bored out of their minds. So what this book will do is guide people to try to understand the kind of procrastinator they are, and then suggest some frameworks that people can use to help bridge this gap between intention and action.
Yeah, no, I love the ebook, and definitely identified with the avoider, but realize the trouble that's causing me subconsciously with this kind of like battle behind the scenes. So look forward to trying some of those methods out too.
Yeah, I hope you'll enjoy them.
All right. Well, Srini, definitely appreciate your time, and again, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and knowledge here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.